As you probably all know, the word bar mitzvah means, does anybody know what it means? No, Igor, I'm not asking you. Bar is Aramaic for son, and mitzvah is commandment. And it refers to a boy, I don't need to tell you this, who having reached the age of 13 is called to the Torah to read the weekly parashah and to demonstrate his understanding of the passage he reads. Now, bar mitzvah, son of the commandment, might suggest that one is bound to take part in the service and read from the Torah, just as you have done so well, Sai, this evening and will do tomorrow morning. Because the word mitzvah comes from the Hebrew verb tzivah, which means to command. And while a boy, and in our synagogue a girl, automatically become bar or bat mitzvah, subject to the commandments when they reach the age of puberty, in our own synagogue 13 for both boys and girls, we do things here a little differently. We don't assume that all students want to stand up and read publicly from the Torah. They may be lacking confidence, although being called to the Torah certainly does a great deal for a young person's confidence in themselves. They may not feel that bar or bat mitzvah will mean something to them. Perhaps their parents didn't celebrate a bar or bat mitzvah. Perhaps they don't come from an observant family. Perhaps their belief system prevents them from taking part in a religious service such as this. Whatever the reason for celebrating or not celebrating a bar or bat mitzvah, here at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, there is a choice. Young people are always asked, would you like to become bar or bat mitzvah? And whether the answer is yes or no, we pursue the reasons and so understand the basis on which a person makes their choice. But it is never assumed. It is never commanded. And at every step of the way, from the choice young people make about the verses from the Sedra they wish to read, to the way they choose to interpret their parashah, we give them the opportunity to choose for themselves how they want to celebrate this important occasion. The issue of choice raises an important philosophical question in Judaism. If we have choice in our lives, if we have what the rabbis called reshut, free will, how do we reconcile that freedom of choice in our lives with the idea, equally powerful, that God knows and sees everything, and that divine knowledge is not constrained or limited in any way at all? In other words, if God's existence transcends time and space, if God knows what has been, what is, and what will be in the future, how is it that we can choose freely how to live our lives? And how is God not able to prevent evil from happening if he knows it's going to happen? How come God, who is all-powerful and all-good, does not stop wars or prevent the daily tragedies we see in the news from happening? It is Rabbi Akiva, the famous teacher of the 1st century of the Common Era, who summarizes in just 4 Hebrew words this knotty paradox in the famous saying, Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna, which means all is foreseen and free will is given. Akiva declares that God has divine foreknowledge of all things. God sees what is going to happen even in the future. And yet, at the same time, you and I, humanity, are endowed with freedom, free will, the ability to choose between good and evil. Akiva doesn't attempt to reconcile these two opposing statements. Both are real and both are true. God is powerful, omniscient, and good, and human beings, free to choose between good and evil, can opt for a harmful and damaging pathway that brings about evil for themselves and for others, or can choose to do good. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses too expresses that freedom of choice for the Israelites. Re'ei natati lefanecha hayom et ha'chaim ve'et ha'tov ve'et ha'mavet ve'et ha'ra. See, I set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. V'charta b'chayim. Choose life, if you and your offspring would live, by loving the Eternal One your God, heeding God's commands, and holding fast to God. And the prophet Jeremiah draws our attention to God's omniscience. If a person enters a hiding place, do I not see him, says the Eternal One? For I fill both heaven and earth, declares the Eternal One. Even in the most hidden of places, God can see all things. Although the two elements of God's omniscience and a human being's freedom of choice seem irreconcilable, some sages in the Talmud did try to harmonize the idea of determinism, that everything is predetermined by God, with the idea of free will, by separating nature from nurture. The Talmud introduces an extended discussion about whether the day of the week or which star you were born under determine the kind of person you're going to be, or what is going to happen in your life. A bit like the nursery rhyme, Monday's child is fair of face, Tuesday's child is full of grace, and so on. Talmud is a little less complimentary. Monday's child, says the Talmud, will be short-tempered because that is the day in the creation story that the upper and lower waters were divided. Therefore, it's a day of contentiousness. But Tuesday's child will be rich because that is the day that the vegetation was created, and so on and so forth. However, Maimonides vigorously refutes this view in the Talmud, which he says is an absurd view held by the astrologers. If it were the case that the constellation we were born under would determine who we are going to be, that would go against the whole idea that we have the agency to choose how to live our lives. It's what makes us essentially human, says Maimonides. Our conduct is entirely in our own hands. No compulsion is exerted, and no external influence is brought to bear upon us that would constrain us either to be virtuous or vicious. Free will is bestowed on every human being, says Maimonides. If one desires to turn towards the good way and be righteous, one has the power to do so. If one wishes to turn towards the evil way and be wicked, one is at liberty to do so. That is why at the beginning of the Torah, when God discovers that Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit from the forbidden tree, God says, "Behold, the human being is become as one of us, knowing good and evil." What this means is that the human species has become unique in the world. Free will is what endows us with our humanity, both for good and evil. No other species is like us in being able to exercise our own intelligence and reason, discerning the difference between good and evil. So as we celebrate your Bar Mitzvah Sai, the fruit of your own choice and decisions, may we value and cherish the preciousness of our freedom to choose at all times what is good and righteous, loving God, walking in God's ways, and choosing to keep God's moral commandments and laws, so that we may thrive and have life and long endure in prosperity and peace. Amen.